In this video, I'm going to share 10 things about the Nikon 180-600 that you probably did not know about, and why I absolutely love this lens for shooting wildlife. You might think it's just another Z lens with faster autofocus, but trust me, there's so much more to it. Features that make a real difference in the field. And if you stick around till the end, I'll also share a couple of things I wish Nikon had done better. So by the time this video is over, you'll know if this lens is a perfect fit for you. Before we dive in, let me first set the scene. I've spent years trying out multiple lenses, from the Tamron 150-600, the Nikon 200-500, and the Z100-400. I've taken these lenses out into the wild, capturing everything from elusive owls to majestic lions to slithery serpents. So, if those lenses got the job done, why switch? If it ain't broke, why fix it? Well, the Nikon 180-600 didn't just replace my old gear, it changed the game. There are some things about this lens that genuinely helped me create better wildlife photography and videography, and today I'm sharing 10 reasons why I love this lens. But first, for those new to my channel, my name is Terrence and I've been a wildlife photographer and videographer for the past 10 years. I am currently a Nikon ambassador, and I've also worked with other brands and organizations to create content around wildlife and wildlife photography. That said, this video is not swayed by the fact that I have a working relationship with Nikon. I bought this lens with my own money, and these are really my own opinions backed by real-world field experience. So, let's begin. So we all know that the 180-600 is supposed to have better autofocus, but how much better really? Well, that entirely depends on the camera that you slap it onto. I've tested this lens on the Z6 III, the Z6 II, and the Z5, and here's what I found. Pair it with a camera with killer autofocus like the Z6 III, and you're looking at some seriously impressive keeper rates. In fact, compared to my old 200-500 f-mount on the Z6 III, I saw at least a 10% boost in sharp shots, and that number climbs even higher if you're tracking smaller, faster subjects like birds. But pair it with a camera with less than ideal autofocus like the Z5, and well, let's just say I've missed focus on more shots than I'd like to admit. At that point, it's not the lens that's holding you back, it's the camera. So if you're eyeing the 180-600, but your camera's autofocus isn't up to par, consider upgrading your body first to really unlock this lens's full potential. And the improvements don't stop at speed. This lens is also whisper quiet. If you've used older DSLR telephoto lenses, you know the sound of those mechanical gears grinding away as they hunt for focus. With the 180-600, dead silence. For wildlife photography, that's a game changer. It means fewer subtle animals and more natural, undisturbed moments captured in the wild. One thing I also really love about this lens is the focal range, 180-600. It's a little wider at the short end than similar lenses like Nikon's own 200-500 or Sony's 200-600. And at the long end, it beats Canon 100-500 by an extra 100mm. Now, does that extra bit of range actually matter? Well, at 180, the difference isn't huge. But if you like capturing wildlife in its environment, that little bit of extra width can come in handy. But 600 versus 500, well, that's now a real advantage. If you're shooting with a high megapixel camera, you might have more wiggle room to crop. But if you're like me, primarily shooting with a 24 megapixel camera like the Z6 III, that extra 100mm does give you more reach without relying on heavy cropping. And that means sharper, more detailed shots straight out of the camera. So far, I've had zero complaints about the focal range on this lens. It's versatile enough to cover just about anything a wildlife photographer could need. One feature that everyone seems to rave about with this lens, the internal zoom. Now, when I first heard about the internal zoom, I'll admit I wasn't at all impressed. Back then, I was using the Nikon 200-500 and I thought, why does it matter if it zooms internally? After all, the 200-500 is smaller at its shortest and easier to pack than the 180-600. But after spending some time with the 180-600, I've been totally converted. Let me explain why. First off, internal zooms are a game changer for keeping dust and moisture out. With external zoom lenses, every time you zoom in or out, you're inviting dust and particles into the mechanism, and over time that can cause issues. Internal zooms, no such problem. They help keep the lens sealed better against the elements, which is a big win for outdoor shooting. Second, the balance factor. If you use a tripod or monopod a lot like I do, You know the drill. Every time you zoom in and out on an external zoom lens, you have to spend precious seconds adjusting and rebalancing the camera. With an internal zoom lens, the weight stays pretty much the same, so you don't have to waste time fiddling with adjustments. Honestly, after using this internal zoom, I don't think I could go back to an external zoom lens. It's just that much more convenient. And as I mentioned earlier, the weather sealing on this lens is a huge step up, say compared to the Nikon 200 to 500. I've taken this lens out in light rain and dusty conditions, and so far it's been holding up beautifully. When you're out in the wild chasing wildlife, you don't want to constantly worry about babying your gear. With the improved sealing on this 180 to 600, I can focus more on the shot and land on whether the lens is going to give up on me. Less worry, more shooting. That's the dream. That said, if I'm caught in a torrential downpour, I'm not going to risk it. I'll still be careful not to push my luck and make sure to clean it afterward. When you're working with a super telephoto lens like this, you're going to spend a lot of time at the long end. So in this case at 600mm. The good news is, this lens holds up surprisingly well at 600, even wide open at f6.3. It's reasonably sharp, and for most situations, I don't feel like I'm sacrificing too much detail. That said, if I've got enough light, I'll often stop down to f8 to really get the sharpest results possible. But even at f6.3, the sharpness is pretty solid and definitely noticeable when compared to my old 200 to 500 or other f-mount super telephoto lenses I've used. Now, let's be real, it's not going to outshoot a prime lens like a 500 f4 in terms of ultimate sharpness, but for what I do, especially when most of my work ends up on social media, I'm more than happy with the results. It's sharp enough to keep me confident in the quality without feeling like I'm missing out on anything important. I also shoot a lot of wildlife video with this lens, and let me tell you, it's a much more pleasant experience compared to my old 200 to 500. For starters, the smoother focusing on this lens makes a world of difference. Focus hunting is pretty much reduced to a minimum, and when it locks onto a subject, it stays locked. Even when the subject moves perpendicular to the plane of focus, the shift is smooth and subtle, nothing too jarring or distracting. This is especially important in wildlife video where you don't want the viewer's attention to be taken away by abrupt focus changes. One of the standout features of the 180-600 has got to be the stabilization. This lens promises a solid 5.5 stops of stabilization, and trust me, it delivers. Where you really see this shine is when shooting video handheld. I typically carry a tripod or monopod with me, but there are times when I need to shoot handheld, and it always blows me away how stable the footage is. I've even filmed whales on a boat, handheld, and I can't think of a better test for stabilization than that. I'm not saying you should go handheld all the time. I still recommend using some sort of support system when you're filming, but with the 180-600, you can definitely capture some surprisingly steady footage if you're able to hold the camera steady and make slow, controlled movements. Here's a small but super useful feature that I love about the 180-600, the locking lens hood. If you've ever used lenses with a non-locking hood, you'll know how annoying it can be when the hood gets knocked off or shifts out of place. I've had my lens hood drop off countless times on my older DSLR telephoto lenses when I had to charge through thick brush, knocking into branches along the way. With the 180-600, the lens hood locks into place, which means it stays secure and doesn't slip off easily when you're moving around or packing up. It's a simple thing, but it makes a big difference in the field. I've been on shoots where I've had to move quickly, or when I'm carrying my gear through forest environments, and having that lens hood stay locked in place really cuts down on potential headaches. Plus, it's one less thing to worry about when you're out and about focusing on getting the shots. The last thing that really stands out with the 180-600 is how quickly you can go from 180 to 600. With some super telephoto lenses, it can take a good amount of time to zoom from one extreme end to the other, which can be a real pain when you're trying to catch a fast-moving subject. But with this lens, the transition from 180 to 600 is smooth and quick, with only one quick turn of my wrist, which means I can react faster when an animal moves or when I need to adjust my framing. It's a small detail, but it makes a huge difference in real-world shooting, especially in wildlife photography, where every second counts. It's one of those features that's easy to overlook until you're in the field, but once you get used to it, you definitely appreciate how much quicker and more responsive the zoom is. Now, let's talk about things I wish can be improved. One thing that I really miss compared to my old 200 to 500, the constant aperture. For photos, it's not such a big deal, but for video, which makes up about 70% of my work, it's something that I have to think about. With video, I'm always trying to cover a scene with a mix of wider and tighter shots. Say I'm filming a bird at 180, then zooming into 600 for a close-up. Those two shots should cut together seamlessly. With a constant aperture lens, I can zoom without having to tweak my exposure settings. But with the 180 to 600, the aperture shifts from f5.6 to 6.3 as I zoom in, meaning that I have to treat it as an f6.3 lens if I want consistent exposure. That also means I'm effectively working with a lens that's one stop slower than my old 200 to 500. I've learned to work around it, and the benefits of this lens honestly outweighs this one drawback. But let's be honest, if Nikon had made this a constant f5.6, I'd be over the moon. This is a minor gripe, but I do wish the minimum focusing distance of the 180 to 600 was shorter. At 600, you're looking at a minimum focusing distance of 2.4 meters, which, let's be honest, isn't exactly close. For comparison, Canon's 150 to 500 lets you focus as close as 1.2 meters at its long end, and Tamron's 150 to 500 gets you down to 1.8 meters. Those lenses let you get much closer to smaller subjects, which can really be quite useful in certain situations. Now, I'm not saying that I expect this to double as a macro lens, but there have been times when I've wanted to get a tighter shot of an animal only to be held back by that minimum focusing distance. It's not a deal breaker, but it's one of those little things that I find myself wishing was just a bit better. So that's my take on the Nikon 180 to 600 from the perspective of a wildlife photographer and videographer. Do I love it? Absolutely. Will I be replacing it anytime soon? Probably not a chance. This lens has served me incredibly well over the past 6 months. If you're considering this lens, my advice? Try before you buy. If possible, rent it for a day or two and see how it fits your shooting style. I wasn't completely sold at first either, until I loaned it for a week. That's when I realized just how good this was, and let's just say, my wallet did not stand a chance after that. So, give it a go and see if it elevates your photography and videography, and let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe. If you want to support my channel, you can buy me a cup of coffee, link in the description down below.